The city streets were busy as usual, filled with honking cars, tired workers rushing home, and children playing near the sidewalks. But hidden beneath this normal daily life, there were people who misused their power for selfish gain. Among them was Officer Reyes, a man who had worn the uniform for more than 15 years. To many, he looked like an experienced police officer, a man of law and order. But those who had lived under his shadow knew another side of him. He was not a protector of justice. He was a man who used his badge to create fear, and then used that fear to control people for his own benefit. Reyes had grown comfortable in his methods. He believed he was too clever to ever be caught. Over the years, he had learned which people to target and which people to leave alone. He always avoided those who had strong connections or family members in positions of power. Instead, he looked for ordinary people, the ones who seemed vulnerable, the ones who would never dare to fight back. He had built a reputation in the darker corners of the city, a reputation that left innocent people frightened but left him feeling untouchable. One evening, while driving his patrol car down a quiet street, Reyes noticed a woman walking home with grocery bags in her hands. She was dressed simply, and there was nothing about her that suggested wealth or influence. He slowed down the car and watched her closely. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she walked alone, without anyone by her side, or maybe it was just that she looked new to the neighborhood. To Reyes, she seemed like the perfect target. The days passed slowly, and the tension between Officer Reyes and Anila grew like a quiet storm. On the surface, their conversations seemed like ordinary exchanges between a police officer and a resident, but underneath, there was a dangerous game unfolding. Reyes believed he was tightening his grip, while Anila silently collected the ropes he was weaving, preparing to tie them around him at the right moment. Reyes had grown restless. He had spent years blackmailing and threatening people, and usually, by this time, his victims would already be offering him something: money, favors, or silence in exchange for peace. But Anila was different. She never begged, never panicked, never showed weakness. This both irritated him and made him more determined. He told himself that she was simply hiding her fear, and it was only a matter of time before she broke. One evening, as Anila returned from work, she found Reyes waiting for her at the entrance of her building again. He had his arms crossed, his expression stern, as if he was standing there to enforce some serious law. "Miss," he said sharply, stepping into her path, "I checked some things today. Your name doesn't appear clearly in the local records. That's a problem." Anila raised her eyebrows slightly, her face calm. "I don't think there's a problem, officer. My documents are complete." Reyes leaned closer, lowering his voice to a threatening tone. "You don't understand. If your name isn't clear in the records, it could mean you're living here illegally. That could lead to fines, or even worse. But I can help you if you cooperate." Anila looked at him silently for a few moments. Inside, she felt almost amused at his boldness, but she kept her expression neutral. Then, in a gentle voice, she said, "And what does cooperate mean, officer?" Reyes smirked. This was the moment he had been waiting for. To him, her question was a sign of weakness, proof that she was finally beginning to fear him. He folded his arms and gave her a look of false authority. "It means you make things easier for me," he said slowly. "I can overlook small mistakes. I can make sure nothing bad appears in your file. But that kind of help, it isn't free." Anila's eyes narrowed slightly. She understood his game perfectly. But instead of confronting him, she gave a small nod. "I see. I'll think about it." She walked past him without another word, leaving him standing there with a satisfied grin. He thought he had finally pushed her in the right direction. He did not notice that she had discreetly turned on her small recorder before he started talking. Every word he had spoken was now saved, clear and undeniable. That night, Anila sat at her desk, listening to the recording. The officer's voice came through clearly, full of arrogance and hidden threats. She saved the file carefully, labeling it with the date and time. It was the first strong piece of evidence against him. But she knew she would need more. She wanted to build a case so strong that no excuse could protect him. The following day, Riaz decided to push harder. He stopped Anila as she was leaving her building in the morning. "So, did you think about what I said?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, I thought about it," Anila replied calmly. "And?" he pressed. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to hesitate. "I'm not sure what you want exactly." Riaz smiled coldly. "I want you to understand that nothing in this city is free. If you want to stay here without trouble, you'll need to keep me happy. Otherwise, I can make life very difficult for you." Again, she listened quietly, nodded slowly, and walked away. Again, her recorder captured every word. Over the next week, this pattern continued. Riaz became bolder each day, convinced that he was slowly breaking her down. He began suggesting more directly that she should pay him to avoid trouble. His voice carried the same false authority, the same arrogance of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. Anila, meanwhile, stayed calm and polite. Sometimes she gave small, vague answers. Sometimes she smiled faintly, letting him think he was winning. Each time, her recorder stayed hidden, capturing his threats. She also began keeping written notes of his behavior, marking the dates, the times, and the places where he stopped her. But it wasn't only about collecting evidence. Anila also wanted to understand him. She studied his words, his body language, his behavior. She realized that Riaz had built his entire confidence on the belief that people would never fight back. He relied on silence and fear. He had never faced someone who could stand against him, let alone someone who held the power of law in her hands. At his police station, Riaz bragged to his colleagues about how he was handling a new woman in his area. He laughed as he told stories, twisting the truth to make himself look powerful. Some of his colleagues listened silently, some laughed along, and some looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge him. He had created an atmosphere where fear even spread among his fellow officers. One rainy evening, as Anila was about to enter her building, Riaz blocked her path once more. His voice was sharper now, as if he was running out of patience. "I've been more than generous with you," he hissed. "Do you know how much trouble you could be in? But I can make all of it disappear if you just do what I say." Anila looked at him with calm eyes. "And what exactly do you say, officer?" Riaz smirked, lowering his voice. "I say you need to start paying me if you want to live here peacefully." This time, Anila allowed a look of concern to flicker across her face just for a second. Enough to feed his ego. She nodded slowly. "I understand." He smiled, satisfied, and walked away. He did not notice that Anila's phone, hidden in her pocket, had captured the entire conversation. Later that night, she sat in her living room, listening to the recording once again. Each piece of evidence was building a stronger case. Soon, she would have enough to bring everything forward. She thought about the people who had probably suffered before her, those who had given him money or lived in fear, believing they had no other choice. For them, she was determined to see this through. The storm outside raged, rain striking the windows, thunder echoing across the sky. Anila sat quietly, her face calm, her eyes steady. Riaz believed he was the hunter, but in truth, he was already trapped. Every word he spoke was a chain around his own neck. And soon, he would realize that the woman he thought was weak was, in fact, the one holding the key to his downfall. The days of quiet patience were finally over. Anila had collected enough evidence, more than she had originally planned. Recordings, notes, dates, and even statements from a neighbor who had overheard Riaz's threatening tone one evening. All of it was stored safely. Every piece of proof painted a clear picture of a corrupt officer who had used his badge as a weapon against the people he was meant to protect. But Anila was not the kind of person who acted in anger. She knew that justice had to be served in the right way, following the law she had sworn to uphold. If she confronted him too soon without the proper steps, he might slip away, using excuses or support from others inside the system. No, she needed to be precise, professional, and strategic. And now, the time had come. That evening, Riaz stopped her once again, but this time, his tone was different. He was impatient, almost demanding. Enough games, he snapped as she stepped out of her building. I've given you chances, but you're testing me. Do you want me to file charges against you? Do you want me to drag you into the station? Anila looked at him silently for a long moment. Then she gave a small, calm smile. Maybe we should go to the station, she said softly. Riaz blinked, confused. What? Maybe we should go, she repeated, her voice steady. In fact, let's go together. I would like to explain something to you in front of your colleagues. For the first time, Riaz felt a flicker of unease. Her tone was not that of a frightened woman. It carried quiet authority, the kind he was not used to hearing from someone he thought was powerless. He frowned, brushing it off, convincing himself she was bluffing. Don't play smart, he growled. I'm giving you one last chance. Anila took a step closer, her eyes meeting his directly. No, officer, she said firmly. I'm giving you your last chance. There was silence. Riaz stared at her, trying to understand her words. But before he could speak again, Anila reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. She handed it to him. Read it, she said simply. Riaz, confused and irritated, opened the folder. Inside was an official letter, stamped and signed, announcing the appointment of Anila Raman as the new Assistant Attorney General. His eyes widened as he read the words, his face draining of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Anila watched him calmly. Do you understand now? She asked gently. Riaz stammered, his voice shaking. Why this must be a mistake. There is no mistake, Anila replied firmly. I am the Assistant Attorney General. And I have been recording every word you've said to me for the past 2 weeks. Every threat, every demand, every lie. Riaz's hands trembled as he held the folder. His mind raced, but he could not find a way out. For the first time in years, fear entered his heart, the kind of fear he had forced on so many innocent people. You see, Anila continued, her tone calm but sharp, you thought I was an ordinary woman you could scare. You thought I had no power, no voice. But you were wrong. And now, officer, it's over. Riaz's knees felt weak. He tried to speak, but all he could manage was, please, let's talk. We can solve this privately. Anila shook her head. No. This is not private anymore. You chose to use your uniform to harm people. Now you will answer for it. The next morning, Anila walked into the police station, not as a victim but as the Assistant Attorney General. She carried with her a carefully prepared file of evidence against Riaz. The station, usually filled with routine activity, grew silent as word spread of who she really was. Officers stood straighter, whispering among themselves, as she requested to meet with the head of internal affairs. When the officer in charge arrived, she handed him the file. Inside were recordings, written notes, and witness statements. The evidence was undeniable. I expect immediate action, Anila said firmly. This officer has misused his badge for far too long. People like him destroy the trust between the police and the public. That cannot continue. The head of internal affairs nodded, his expression serious. You have our full cooperation, ma'am. An investigation will begin at once. Meanwhile, Riaz sat at his desk, his mind spinning in panic. He had heard whispers that Anila was in the station, and the truth was spreading fast. Some of his colleagues, who once avoided challenging him, now looked at him with disgust. The arrogance he had carried for years was crumbling around him. Later that afternoon, two senior officers entered his office. "Officer Reyes," one of them said coldly, "you are suspended from duty effective immediately, pending investigation." Reyes tried to argue, his voice desperate. "This is a misunderstanding. She's lying," but before he could finish, the officer placed a file on his desk. Inside were the recordings. His own voice filled the room, clear and sharp, demanding money, making threats, using his position for personal gain. The sound of his own corruption left him speechless. Anila, standing nearby, watched silently. She did not need to raise her voice or show anger. The truth spoke louder than anything else. In the following days, the investigation uncovered more than Anila had expected. Other residents came forward, encouraged by her courage. They shared their own experiences, their own stories of how Reyes had pressured or threatened them. Some admitted they had paid him out of fear. With every testimony, the case against him grew stronger. For Reyes, the walls closed in quickly. The man who once believed he was untouchable now found himself isolated, exposed, and powerless. His name became a warning, not of authority, but of corruption brought to light. Anila, however, remained steady. She attended every meeting, every review, ensuring that the process was fair and just. She did not allow personal anger to guide her actions. She let the law do its work, because she believed that true justice was not about revenge, it was about accountability. One evening, after a long day of hearings, Anila walked home through the quiet streets. The air felt lighter, the city somehow calmer. She knew the case was not finished yet, the trial and formal charges were still ahead, but the hardest part was done. The mask had been removed, the truth revealed. She thought of the first day she had seen Reyes, leaning against his car, confident and arrogant. And she thought of how quickly that confidence had vanished when the truth confronted him. It reminded her of an old lesson she had learned during her career: power without justice is nothing but weakness waiting to be exposed. That night, as she sat by her window sipping tea, she felt a sense of peace. She had not only defended herself but also opened the door for many others to find their voices. The people who once stayed silent now saw that corruption could be challenged, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, always had a way of catching up. And for Officer Reyes, the days of fear he had spread were finally turning back on him. The man who thought he controlled everything was now learning the hardest truth of all, that no one is above the law. The investigation against Officer Reyes moved quickly. The evidence Anila had collected was so strong that there was no room for excuses. His voice on the recordings was clear, his threats undeniable. The testimonies of local residents added more weight to the case. People who once stayed silent now came forward, encouraged by the fact that someone powerful was standing with them. For years, they had carried fear in their hearts, but now they saw a chance for justice. Inside the police department, whispers spread like wildfire. Reyes had once walked those halls with arrogance, boasting about his power, but now he avoided every gaze. Officers who once laughed at his jokes now turned their faces away. Some shook their heads in disappointment, while others muttered quietly about how long they had suspected his corruption. The badge he once wore with pride had become a symbol of his shame. Anila followed every step of the case carefully. She reviewed the investigation reports, met with the inquiry committee, and made sure no detail was overlooked. She had dealt with many cases before, but this one carried a special weight. It was not just about punishing one man, it was about sending a message that corruption in uniform could not be tolerated. When the formal charges were announced, the city's newspapers reported the story widely. "Officer suspended for blackmail," the headlines read. Reyes' photograph appeared alongside the reports, his face filled with stress and defeat. For the first time, the public saw him not as an untouchable officer but as a man who had misused his authority and was now facing justice. The trial began a few weeks later in a packed courtroom. Journalists, citizens, and officials filled the benches, curious to see how the case would unfold. Riaz sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, his eyes downcast. Gone was the swagger, the confident smirk. In its place was the look of a man trapped by his own actions. Anila entered the courtroom with quiet confidence. She was not there as a victim but as a representative of justice. When she spoke, her words were calm and precise. She presented the recordings, each one played aloud for the court to hear. The room was filled with the sound of Riaz's voice demanding money, making threats, abusing his power. Each word struck like a hammer, breaking down the last of his defense. Witnesses stepped forward, one by one. A shopkeeper told the judge how Riaz had once demanded free goods. A taxi driver explained how he had been forced to pay bribes to avoid false fines. A young man described how Riaz had threatened to charge him with crimes he never committed. Their voices were shaky but strong, filled with years of hidden pain finally being released. Riaz's lawyer tried to argue that the recordings were misunderstood, that the witnesses were exaggerating, but the evidence was too clear. The judge listened carefully, his face stern, his patience wearing thin with every failed excuse. At one point, Riaz himself stood and tried to defend his actions. "I was only doing my duty," he said, his voice breaking. "I never meant harm. These are lies against me." But the judge stopped him. "Your own voice betrays you," he said firmly. "Your duty was to protect the people, not to prey upon them. You wore a badge of trust, and you misused it. That is one of the greatest betrayals of law and order." Silence filled the room. Riaz sat down heavily, his hands shaking. He knew, in that moment, that his fight was over. Finally, after days of testimony, the judge gave the verdict. Officer Riaz was found guilty of corruption, blackmail, and abuse of authority. His police service record was permanently stained, and he was sentenced to years in prison. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some voices angry at his betrayal, others relieved that justice had been served. Anila sat quietly, listening to the verdict with calm eyes. She did not celebrate loudly or smile in triumph. For her, justice was never about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth had spoken clearly that day. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around her, eager to hear her words. She stood before the cameras, her posture straight, her voice steady. "This case is not just about one officer," she said. "It is about the system we live in, and the people we trust to protect us. Corruption cannot be ignored. Fear cannot silence us. Today's judgment is a reminder that no one is above the law, and that justice belongs to every citizen." Her words spread across the city, printed in newspapers, replayed on television. People in neighborhoods far and wide talked about her courage. Ordinary citizens felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the system could change for the better if people stood up against injustice. In the days that followed, Anila returned to her regular duties as Assistant Attorney General. But something had changed. People recognized her on the streets. Shopkeepers greeted her with respect. Families sent her letters of gratitude. Some shared their own stories of suffering under corruption, hoping she could help them too. Anila listened to each one patiently, knowing that her work was far from over. She understood that Riaz was only one man, and though his punishment was necessary, there were many others who still hid behind their positions. The fight against corruption was long and difficult, but she was ready for it. Meanwhile, in prison, Riaz sat alone in his cell. The man who once stood tall in his uniform now wore the plain clothes of an inmate. The respect he once demanded had vanished. Other prisoners mocked him, calling him the officer who got caught. Every day, he was reminded of the power he had lost, the badge he could never wear again. He thought often about Anila. At first, he hated her for destroying his life. But as the weeks turned into months, a heavy truth settled in his heart: he had destroyed himself. She had only shown the world what he had chosen to become. The guilt weighed on him, heavier than the prison walls around him. Back in her apartment, Anila sat one evening by her window, watching the city lights. She thought about the journey she had taken, the patience, the risks, the long nights gathering evidence. She thought about the fear Reyes had tried to place in her heart, and how she had turned that fear into strength. She realized that true strength was not about shouting or showing power. It was about standing firm in silence, about letting the truth speak for itself. And the truth, once revealed, was stronger than any weapon. The city moved on, but the story of Officer Reyes became a lesson. Parents told their children about it, teachers spoke of it in classrooms, and officers inside the department remembered it as a warning. It became a reminder that power without honesty leads only to downfall, and that justice, though sometimes slow, always arrives. As for Anila, she carried on with her life, her heart steady and her mind clear. She had many more battles to fight, many more cases to handle, but she never forgot the look on Reyes' face the moment he realized who she was. That moment was proof that corruption, no matter how strong it pretends to be, always trembles before the truth. And so the story ended not with noise, but with a quiet victory. A corrupt officer had fallen, justice had prevailed, and the people of the city had been reminded of their power. The law was not just words on paper, it was alive, carried by those who dared to defend it. Anila closed her eyes, breathing deeply, ready for the days ahead. For she knew that as long as there were people like Reyes, there had to be people like her, people who refused to bow to fear, who stood for justice even in silence. And that was enough to keep her going. His mind worked quickly, as it always did when he thought about new opportunities. He believed she could easily be pressured. After all, most people in her position would be scared if a police officer questioned them or hinted at trouble. And once fear entered their hearts, Reyes knew he could make demands. It was a pattern he had repeated many times before, and it had always worked. The woman did not notice him at first. She continued walking toward a small apartment building. Reyes parked his car at the corner, pretending to check something on his phone. He observed her carefully, noting where she lived and how she moved. His instincts told him that she was new in town, someone without strong connections. That was exactly the type of person he preferred. As she entered the building, he smiled to himself. This will be easy, he thought. He had no idea who she really was. The next day, Reyes began to ask around the neighborhood. He spoke casually with a shopkeeper, pretending it was nothing serious. He described the woman, asking if she was new. The shopkeeper nodded and said she had recently rented a flat in the area. That was all Reyes needed to know. To him, it confirmed his guess that she had no one to protect her. He began to plan how he would approach her. His usual method was simple but effective. First, he would stop the person in a casual way, ask a few intimidating questions, and create the impression that they might be in some kind of legal trouble. Then, when the fear became clear on their faces, he would slowly suggest a way out. Most people would do anything to avoid legal problems, even if they had done nothing wrong. That fear was Reyes' strongest weapon. Later that evening, Reyes saw her again. This time she was walking back from a nearby market. He parked his car, stepped out, and adjusted his uniform to look more official. Then he approached her with a stern expression. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "Can I ask you a few questions?" The woman looked surprised but calm. She shifted the grocery bag in her hands and nodded politely. "Yes, officer. What is it?" Reyes narrowed his eyes, pretending to be serious. "I've noticed you around here recently. Do you live in that building over there?" He pointed toward her apartment block. "Yes," she answered simply. "I moved here last week." Her voice was steady, and she showed no sign of nervousness. But Reyes assumed it was only a matter of time before she felt uneasy. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You know, there have been some complaints about people moving into this area without proper registration. Are you sure all your documents are in order?" The woman looked at him carefully. For a brief second, there was silence between them. Then she gave a small smile. "Yes, officer. Everything is in order." Rais was slightly annoyed by her calmness. Most people would have begun to panic at this stage. But he reminded himself that fear sometimes took longer to show. He decided not to push too hard on the first meeting. Instead, he nodded in a way that suggested he was unconvinced. "Well," he said slowly, "I'll check into it. In the meantime, make sure you're careful. If anything is missing from your papers, it could cause you trouble." She simply nodded again and walked toward her building. Rais watched her go, convinced that she was only pretending to be confident. "She'll break soon," he muttered to himself. That night, he sat in his apartment, thinking about her. He imagined how she would react once he made his real move. He believed it would only take a little more pressure before she gave in. To him, she was just another ordinary woman, someone who would bend under the weight of his threats. But what Rais could not see was the quiet strength behind her calm face. She was not just another citizen, and she was far from powerless. Every word he spoke, every threat he implied, she remembered clearly. She was not afraid, because she knew exactly who she was and what authority she held. She simply chose not to reveal it yet. For now, she allowed him to believe he had control. But deep inside, she was already preparing for the right moment, the moment when his corruption would be exposed for all to see. And so, the game had begun, though only one of them knew how it would end. The next morning, the city awoke as usual, but inside the small apartment on the corner street, the woman sat at her table sipping tea, thinking about the encounter from the night before. To anyone else, the meeting with Officer Rais might have been frightening, but to her, it was nothing more than a test of patience. She had seen people like him before, men who wore uniforms not as symbols of honor but as tools of intimidation. Her name was Anila, and only a few close people in the city knew her new role. Just a week earlier, she had officially been appointed the Assistant Attorney General. It was a position she had worked for all her life, one that demanded intelligence, honesty, and courage. She had studied law with dedication, faced countless challenges, and fought many difficult battles in court. Her reputation was one of fairness and strength. Yet, Anila had chosen to keep her new identity quiet when she moved into this neighborhood. She wanted to live simply, without attention or special treatment. But fate had brought her face to face with Officer Rais, a man whose arrogance blinded him. He saw her as an easy target, unaware that she had the authority to end his career with just a few words and the evidence of his actions. As she prepared to leave for her office, she thought about his tone, his words, and his attempt to create fear. She smiled faintly. He had no idea who he was speaking to. Still, she decided not to reveal herself too soon. She knew from experience that corruption was like a disease. It was not enough to stop one act. To truly defeat it, you had to expose it fully, gather the proof, and show the truth to the world. Later that day, she walked into her new office, a place filled with files, busy assistants, and the constant sound of phones ringing. She was welcomed with respect by her colleagues, many of whom admired her work from before. She gave her attention to her duties, signing documents, reviewing cases, and meeting with her staff. But in the back of her mind, the image of Officer Rais remained. She thought of all the victims who might have fallen into his trap before. Ordinary men and women who probably could not fight back, who might have paid him out of fear, or suffered in silence. If he had approached her so confidently, it meant he had done it many times before. That thought strengthened her decision. She would not confront him directly yet. Instead, she would let him continue his act, while she quietly prepared to catch him with undeniable proof. That evening, as she returned to her apartment, she noticed Rais's car parked once again at the corner. He leaned against it, arms crossed, waiting. When he saw her, he straightened his posture, trying to look intimidating. Anila, however, remained calm, carrying her small bag of groceries as if nothing unusual was happening. "Good evening," Rais said with a sharp tone. I hope you've thought about what I told you yesterday. Anila stopped, looked at him with steady eyes, and answered politely, I have nothing to worry about, officer. My papers are fine. Her calmness annoyed him. He was used to seeing people stumble over their words, showing fear, asking for help. But she showed none of that. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Listen carefully. If I find anything wrong, even the smallest thing, you'll be in serious trouble. It won't be easy to fix, unless you cooperate. Anila tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. She gave a gentle smile. I understand, she said, and then walked past him into her building. Rise clenched his teeth. Her smile felt like a challenge. He convinced himself that she was just pretending, that soon she would break. He told himself that she must be nervous deep down, even if she was hiding it. But in truth, she was not nervous at all. She was letting him dig his own grave, step by step. The following days followed a similar pattern. Rise would appear at different times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at night, always trying to press her. He asked questions about her job, her background, her family. Anila gave simple answers, never revealing too much, but never showing fear either. At the same time, she began keeping notes of every interaction. She wrote down the time, the words he used, and his threatening tone. She even managed to record some conversations discreetly. As an attorney, she knew that evidence was everything. Without it, even the most corrupt officers could slip away. But with it, justice could not be denied. One afternoon, while sitting in her office reviewing a legal case, she thought deeply about the irony of her situation. She, the newly appointed Assistant Attorney General, responsible for protecting citizens from injustice, was being tested in her own neighborhood by a corrupt cop. She almost laughed at the coincidence, but then reminded herself that life often worked in strange ways. Perhaps this was not a coincidence at all, but an opportunity, a chance to uncover the truth not only about him but about the system that allowed men like him to thrive. Meanwhile, Rise continued to underestimate her. He began telling stories to his colleagues, boasting that he had found a naive woman who would soon be under his control. His arrogance grew, and with it, his mistakes. He started putting pressure on her more openly, without realizing that every word was becoming part of a bigger case against him. One evening, when Anila returned home, Rise followed her into the entrance of the building. He lowered his voice to a whisper, trying to sound dangerous. If you don't want trouble, you better listen to me. Things can get very complicated for people who don't cooperate with the police. Anila stopped, turned to face him directly, and looked into his eyes. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. I hear you, officer. Don't worry, I'm listening. Her answer gave him confidence, as he thought she was finally breaking. But in reality, she was only letting him walk deeper into the trap he was building for himself. That night, Anila sat by her window, the city lights shining in the distance. She thought about the people of the city, the hard-working families, the honest shopkeepers, the students, the mothers, the fathers. They deserved officers who protected them, not officers like Rise who preyed on their fears. She felt a renewed determination. She would not allow his corruption to continue. But she also knew she had to be patient. If she exposed him too soon, he might escape punishment with excuses or lies. No, she would wait until the moment was right, until she had everything she needed. Then, she would reveal the truth not only to him but to everyone. For now, she kept her silence, letting him believe he had the upper hand. But in her heart, she knew that the day of reckoning was coming. And when it arrived, it would be Rise who stood powerless, facing the very justice he thought he could control.